Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Trapped in History podcast. I am your host, Robbie Malcomson. Due to a handful of recent requests within the AP European History Facebook group page, I've decided to record a teaching strategy episode tonight, specifically for the first 2 days of Unit 3, Absolutism and Constitutionalism. Now remember, I teach 40-minute periods daily, whereas some of you may teach a blog class for around an hour and a half. This would still ideally work with those blog classes for being able to complete within 1 day. Before we dive deep into the episode further, I want to recommend a book for any teacher who might be teaching AP European or World History, and that book is entitled The Fabrication of Louis XIV by Peter Burke. I will link that in the Amazon link in the description of the show. It doesn't just focus only on Louis XIV, but also focuses on other leaders and rulers and how they use methods to legitimize their power, whether that be in art, architecture, or using a currency. I also had a small TikTok about that I recorded yesterday as well, about how rulers like Louis may use currency because it's something that the citizens use every day, and it's one of those subtle things that is a little calm reminder that, this person's in charge. This person is the one you're focusing on. So, some of you may have heard on an earlier episode, we go to school where I teach at in Kentucky a lot earlier than many schools, and part of that reason is because we have 2-week breaks between every 9 weeks. So I've been actually on fall break for the last week and a half. Another reason along moving and others why I haven't recorded in a while. So I will not start Unit 3 until Monday. So this is being an assignment that I would be doing Monday and Tuesday next week in order to start and contextualize the beginning of Unit 3. Now, within this 2-day activity, I would break it up by usually starting every unit with a Socratic Seminar and ending every unit with a Socratic Seminar review, discussion / debate. Before we end up taking our test. So I'm going to start off on Monday, that first day, or if you're in a blog class, you would start off with this, is you would do a Socratic Seminar. I do plan on going deeper into how I do seminars in a later episode because some people have been wanting to reach out to me more about how I do the seminars. So I won't go super deep into how I break down the methods and then kind of reinforce that strategy. I'm going to go over this episode as though you already know what a Socratic Seminar is and how to use it in an effective way. And then sometime soon I'll do a whole episode focusing on the details of a seminar. So on this first day, they would be sitting in a circle with me. I'm sitting with them as well. And remember, I find it much better when a teacher sits with their students within the seminar. I mean, you have someone like me that I'm 6'8", 260. So it's already intimidating enough on the sophomores. So it's a lot better if I can sit in there with them in the circle. Also, I feel as though I'm in the debate. I'm in the discussion with them. So as they sit down, as they come into the classroom, they're going to have a secondary source in front of them that'll have several paragraphs over topics such as power, control, autonomy, sovereignty, divine right of kings, Louis XIV, Peter the Great, westernization, just different topics like this, and they would have about a 5 to 7 minute window to speed read through that with a highlighter, with a pen, and be able to annotate, looking at for any kind of evidence that may help them in the debate. And this is after they would already see the questions as well. And I don't mind to put those questions for Monday's Socratic Seminar within the show notes as well, in case you want to use any of those. So I find it very important to start every unit off with philosophical questions and argumentation that way, because I feel like there's no prior knowledge yet, and you're trying to introduce the students to the topic, try to get them to personally relate to it. And I think these are some great days to really get them used to exercising their voice, being confident, trying to do argumentation, supporting it with a line of reasoning, all these different things. So even though you work on more fair share of writing, I also can work on those skills while we're speaking as well. So it's good to start off this Socratic Seminar with breaking down a definition of what absolutism and constitutionalism are, and maybe reviewing what power, control, authority, autonomy, and sovereignty are, so that way the group has a consensus on what they believe things are defined as. So on day one activities, this is meant just to lay the foundation for the understanding of absolutism throughout the rest of the unit, and also using visual representations as well. So the papers in front of them are a secondary source, some lists of paragraphs that they're annotating. They also will have 3 images with them. One of the images being that I'll go through extensively tonight will be the illustration of Louis XIV in the Science Academy. The nicer painting version of this drawing was put on the AP exam a couple of years ago on one of the forms. Another visual primary source they have to look at is the cover of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. And then lastly, the other one they would be looking at would be the famous portrait by Hyacinthe Rigaud called The Portrait of Louis XIV. So they're looking at multiple visual representations of what an absolute monarch looks like, again, with no prior knowledge. I want them to look at this, look at it, annotate it with knowing only what they know from Unit 1 and 2, and really only knowing from the point of view of Machiavelli of what a ruler should be like or what a king should be like. So that's what they're going to have in front of them. So quite a few pieces of paper, no word bank or anything like that, because again, it's supposed to be a foundational beginning discussion for that. The next day that they come in is when we break down those visuals that they're looking at for the first time today, and then wrap up what the contextualization for Unit 3 actually is. And I find out over the last 3 or 4 years, this has worked very well. So additionally, another purpose for this project or this strategy is to try to get them to spark an interest and then find some relatability with words like power and control. No, not just these leaders from in the past, but connecting it to today. Now, the complementary secondary source that they're using not only does it mention Louis XIV's reign, a theoretical support on Thomas Hobbes. It has a reference to Machiavelli in a paragraph for Unit 1 to show some continuity there, crossing over, or at least to help them make some connections together, which is another historical skill that we're working on. And of course, the philosophy of the divine right of kings. Now, this strategy, again, is a speed reading strategy with highlighting and using a pen, and it's meant to prepare students to capture the essence of a text while doing it under a time constraint. And as we know in AP, and unfortunately, that AP exam on May 5th is going to be massively under time constraints. So the more you can do exercises with your students as they're getting more experienced under time constraints, the better they're going to be going forward. Now, if they have time, I mainly want them to focus on the writing part. And then as the discussion goes, they can view the visuals and then reference them as we're going, again, with no prior knowledge of these topics beforehand. Because we can go deeper into that on the second day. So the visual one, again, I'll try to link those in the show notes too. If you want the actual Google Docs that I use, you can email me. At the bottom of the show notes, I have my Gmail for the podcast. I also have my school email through Logan County High School. If you want to have access to any of these materials, I would be more than happy to send them to you. So with Louis and the Royal Science Academy, we often discuss how this image represents the centralization of power, Louis XIV's patronage of the sciences, and his control over intellectual life. Also, this gives students an opportunity to reflect on how rulers throughout history have presented themselves in order to legitimize their power. The second visual, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, within this visual, we can see Hobbes' representation of a sovereign as a colossal figure made up of the body politic or the commonwealth. And this is an excellent visual representation to the social contract that he hits on later. And again, the students won't know that to start off, but it's okay that they don't know that. It's something that they're going to gain more knowledge of as we go forward through the unit. It is important to discuss the symbolic representation of authority, the social contract, and this need for an absolute ruler. And this is a great chance to tie back into and make connections to Machiavelli and the Prince from Unit 1. Now, to wrap up day 1, again, we have a primary focus in this discussion for about 30 minutes of the discussion. 10 minutes doing attendance, getting them ready to make those annotations under the time limit. The primary focus of this discussion is on the intersection of political theory with Thomas Hobbes and the practical manifestation of power like Louis XIV. And then consider, before the seminar with the students, to help the students find the same connections with their personal lives throughout other events in history. They're free to make those connections, and I give them extra credit for making realistic connections to other events in history. And I can also put some sample discussion questions at the bottom in the show notes as well. Now, what I was requested on was mainly what I was going to do on day 2, and that is, how exactly do I break down the images, the paintings, the drawings, specifically for absolutism, and specifically the Royal Science Academy one, and the one I'm going to use for the Leviathan. So again, I wanted to kind of rush through the day 1 part, because I'm going to do a whole episode on how exactly to start doing seminars with your students. But now you have a better idea of how I break down the seminars and how I set up using it for the beginning of Unit 3. So let's just move on over to day 2. So day 2 is all about revisiting the sources, especially the visual sources, because for me, I only have time to really go over one or the other, being only a 40-minute class for that day. But if you're in a block class, feel free to revisit, debrief how they did on the Socratic Seminar, because I do believe that dynamic feedback helps tremendously when it comes to doing the seminars. So when they come back in the next day, I have the copies of the visuals in front of them again. They, of course, have their own copy of the annotated written secondary sources they had the day before, that they are free to use as a reference guide the rest of the unit if they want to. Now, whenever we go into recapping these, the purpose of recapping these is to come with a deeper, or to leave class that day with a deeper understanding of what absolutism actually is. And they're going to be annotating the visuals in order to pull out key historical context, symbolism, and trying to make connections to broader themes, whether it's in the past or their personal life, or potentially I can use this moment to bring up things or foreshadow topics that we will talk about later in the unit. Now, the annotation process is different on visuals. On visuals, I will usually require somewhere between 8 and 10 annotations on a visual. My regular classes do at least 5 of those. And this would be going around and circling, labeling the painting, drawing lines off to the sides of what they circle, making connections to things they've seen in the past, writing in what they think that is, how that object or that item or symbol or person represents a greater topic or greater issue. So they're looking in the foreground, they're looking in the background. And that's why that first week of school, we usually break down art together and show them how to do that. So my students already know how to do that whenever they come in. And I don't mind to do an episode on how I break down art later too, if any of you would like me to do something like that. So when you're annotating or teaching annotating, it is important to guide yourself and your students to identify and annotate key features that represent absolutist principles. For example, Louis' dominance over intellectual pursuits, Thomas Hobbes' depiction of the sovereign as the essential to the social order that takes place in England. So make sure to encourage students, and if you're a student, to encourage each other to note any comparisons between different forms of government, highlighting key visual elements that emphasize control and authority. So I'm looking for context clues and symbolism of what is this visual about? How does this represent the greater ideas of the unit? And you can ask your students at the end of this activity, how do these images set the stage for understanding the broader scope of absolutism within Unit 3? And with your students, try to explore these visuals as purely an introduction to how rulers maintain their power and also justify their power, or you want to use words like centralization and legitimization of their power. And try to discuss with your students the role of symbolism in reinforcing political theory. And this is where you could do this activity still in the circle. Like if you wanted to still be in the Socratic Seminar on the second day or in the second half of your block, by all means go for it whenever you're doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right into the how we would annotate these, and I would go through each of the 2 visuals, and then we'll wrap this episode up. I didn't want it to be overly long because I know A lot of teachers are having to teach this really soon. I don't want them to have to listen to too long of a podcast to do that. So first, if you get a chance to as a teacher, if I'm not able to put the link in the show notes, I'll try to do that, is try to find the colorized drawing or image, the front piece that Sebastian Leclerc did, that is entitled King Louis of France Visiting the Royal Academy of Sciences. And we start off first off by always annotating the source line, or as we call the line of attribution. So right away, we're looking for POV, we're looking for point of view. We look at a guy named Sebastian Leclerc. The students would point out by this point that it sounds French, that more than likely this is a French painter or French artist of some way or another. Therefore, they may have some kind of a bias lean one way or another. Maybe they're commissioning this, maybe they're commissioned by the king to do the drawing, or maybe they're doing the drawing to honor Louis XIV. It could be lots of things. They're gaining certain benefits by doing certain drawings and depicting Louis in a certain way. So this drawing is on a front piece from Claude Perrault, and I wanted to break that down. This has so much evidence in it. I always love starting off with this drawing when I first start my unit, and I shared that on the Trapped in History Facebook group page. I shared this on the AP European History Facebook group page. I've also shared it on the TikTok and Substack and those other items too. But I wanted to make sure that I did justice and add kind of as many handful of, or at least some handful of visuals here that they could look at and get some good ideas on. Now, I usually don't have them annotate the bottom part, the illustration, as far as like the description of the illustration. We could go over that. But we will break down, like I'll have them underline 1671 when the drawing was made, and they will put the name of the century or the actual century there, so that would be the 17th century. And then they would put whether it's a primary source or a secondary source. And we use annotating the source line as a way to break down those historical skills of sourcing, for example. And another thing that students will point out, or at least I will point out if they haven't found it yet, is that this is not just an ordinary Academy of Science. And I told them to think of an academy like a university or like a college or some kind of like a science center type of place. But it's not just an unsponsored one. What makes this academy so unique is the word before academy in the source line, and that is the word royal. So right there, the implication that King Louis is the one that Louis XIV commissions this. He's the one that supports this by having it as his Academy of the Sciences. He comes off as an enlightened monarch, as a monarch that sets himself above all the other absolute monarchs around Europe, and comparing to Peter the Great and others like that, because he supports the sciences, he supports progress and advancement, and not just only leans on religion or traditional views from that. So that's basically breaking down the source line. If you're able to include that, if you ask for the Google Doc version of this assignment, you will see my source line already attached on there for you. Now, the actual image itself, if you use the colorized version of that, you'll notice that for the focal point, the only individual that's colored in the image is Louis XIV himself. So often the students will circle him, and they will draw a line off into the margins and write down Louis XIV to go ahead and label that, or the monarch or absolute monarch or someone like that. And they also might write like words like forefront, that he is on the forefront or the foreground of the drawing, which implies maybe that he is more important than the other individuals in the background that are with him. That's more than likely his court or people that work at the Academy of Sciences. And then another thing I ask the students to do is, I say, find the evidence of science. Look around on the drawing, circle certain items, and then tell me what field of science do you think that goes with. So, for example, the beakers and the conduit on the right side of the windows, you can circle that and write down like chemistry. You can circle the bones, the skeletons on the wall, and have anatomy or biology or something like that. You can circle the flower, the pot of flowers, the plants in the left window, and you can put like botany, for example. We have the astronomical kind of globe at the bottom, the maps. We have astronomy, we have geography, we have cartography. We have lots of different pieces of evidence all over the drawing. But also in the background, another great image that is being built in the background is that you see up on top of a little ridge line there is the building or construction going on of the Palace of Versailles that Louis XIV is building for his grandson, Louis XVI. And you also see that lovely courtyard there with the shrubbery and the walkways and whatnot. And that's another thing that students could circle and write the word legitimize with. This is one of those ways where, monarchs are showing off their wealth. Wealth equals power many times. And like I said, it's just a great painting to easily circle and label, somewhere between 5 and 10 items that are on there, trying to help them break that down. Now, whenever you do that part, whenever you're done, this is where as a teacher you can have fun and kind of extend out the discussion for drawings like this in a meaningful fashion by coming up with questions that push the students to now think deeper. For example, the students have annotated the source line. They have annotated the picture. They have done the Socratic Seminar discussion the day before about power and control and autonomy and Machiavelli and those kind of topics. This is where I would ask those students now, somewhere along the lines of, now why? Why would Louis XIV want to be depicted this way? Why would an artist want to depict Louis this way? What would he get out of that? So you can really dive deep into legitimization here, and you can show other images that Louis had done of himself, and why being depicted as a monarch who supports the sciences, how does that benefit him as an absolute monarch compared to other rulers in Europe at that time? So, lots of interesting questions and discussions that you can extend out. And if your students are already sitting in the circle, this is great for an organic, natural discussion to take place between the students. And you can kind of step back into the shadows there a little bit and let them kind of go forward. And you can even have some argumentative questions that are used as well. And just don't forget, like a lot of times when we do questioning in class with the seminars, we will break down the different key parts of the question so they understand clearly what is being asked of them and clearly what they need to address in their answers. So let's move on to the second and last visual. I have two different versions of this visual. I will annotate both in class, but I like the more full paneled version. On my Google Doc, it would be source 4. So we're going to look at a future topic in Unit 3 when we get to the English Civil War, right before the Glorious Revolution in England, and we can get to Thomas Hobbes and his philosophy of the social contract, the Commonwealth, his support for King Charles I, the absolute divine right king in England at that time. And, he's depicted right there on the cover, so you can use either one you want to use. The bigger one is a kind of a nice zoom in of what he looks like and whatnot. So this is another time where we can annotate the source line, which I've already kind of broke that down earlier about, this is a chance to go ahead and have students underline Thomas Hobbes' name. Go ahead and tell them about him being an English political philosopher, a supporter of absolute monarchs. This guy is going to relate very closely to the Italian Machiavelli as far as his philosophy goes. Whereas, Hobbes may not be against the use of religion as a king is doing that or nothing like that to reinforce their power. But like Machiavelli took more of a secular take on monarchy. So there's one of those differences between Hobbes and Machiavelli, other than the fact of the time, obviously, and the location. So this drawing, this front piece of the book, the Leviathan, I also own this as well, is from 1668. And this is one of those ones, again, that it's a book trying to clamor for and argue for support of absolute monarchies. It's a great chance to have students write down that this is 17th century again, that this is also a source to be able to use and get used to those tactics. So we go right into the image. As far as annotating that image, same skills that they did on the last one. And remember, the day before, they could have wrote on these as well. But this is one of those chances where it can say, hey, the day before, the student can say, hey, I've also found that. I thought that was unique. I thought that that's what that meant. Now I know for sure what it means. And they can kind of make corrections off of what they initially thought things meant the day before. So right away, I will have students circle his sword and say that if you look on the larger front piece of that implies that the monarch controls the military, the force used to maintain their power, used to centralize and legitimize their power. The staff on the right side of the drawing, King Charles's left side, I think represents the church and religion. If you look on the full front piece of the drawing, you have a church and like a priest hat and other items that represent that. And think this is a great chance to tell students something that they can't get out of the first visual, and that is, why are many of these absolute monarchs, why are they going to use religion as a way to reinforce them? I mean, imagine if the majority of your subjects are Christian, if you as a king could say, I have divine right from God to be your king. I am like representation of God on earth. I enforce God's laws. So I have that authority there, and it only further legitimizes the image and the rule of the king. This is something that lots of rulers do. For example, the Chinese had something like this called the mandate of heaven. So lots of rulers who seek absolute power will often use religion as a tool to garner support from their subjects, from their populace. Now, I also have students circle the head of the king here. They can circle his crown, and then right above it, that's the word crown, or that's symbolic of monarchy, of absolute rule. And then I also want them to write the word Charles the First, Charles capital I, because this is the first chance they get to hear his name before later in the unit, whenever we get to Charles, and we're breaking that down and going through the English Civil War, and then bringing up Thomas Hobbes again, and Oliver Cromwell, and all those items. So this is a good chance to go ahead and give students a sneak peek of that. So my favorite part of the drawing is actually his shirt. So the long sleeve shirt that he has, it kind of resembles scales because, Leviathan is an ancient biblical sea creature that was like a scaly, like almost like a sea serpent, a sea snake. So the clothing and the shirt that Hobbes has here, from far away, kind of resembles scales on like a snake. But if you zoom in really close, you can tell that they're people, and they're all faced a certain direction. They're all faced at him. And this hits home one of Thomas Hobbes's philosophies here about social contract, is that the populace, the citizens, the subjects, they should willingly give up some of their freedoms and some of their rights for to obey the king, to follow the king, support the king. They're like his armor. But at the same time, for the social contract to work, the king has to be able to afford, or at least the monarch could be queen too. The monarch has to avoid becoming tyrannical, avoid being a tyrant. So it's the king's responsibility to protect the people, to provide protection and guidance to the populace. It's the populace's job to respect that and obey the monarchy. And if that process is working, then a country is more than likely going to be stable. A state will be stable. A monarch might be able to maintain their power along that. So I find this is a great opportunity before you do any kind of written source over Thomas Hobbes or comparing John Locke with Hobbes. A lot of us that teach the course compare both those two together. This is a great visual way to do this that can stick in students' heads before you even get to it. And it makes teaching the topic of the English Civil War later easier, or the debate between Locke and Hobbes easier whenever you get to that. Now, lastly, the students can circle like the size of him. Earlier in the school year, I will usually show them images from the Middle Ages and how Middle Ages art is different than Renaissance art. And often people like monarchs and religious figures are depicted unrealistically large, like huge over top of people, implying their power. And I tell students all the time that if something is depicted up higher or larger, it usually implies more authority, more power, more influence. And you see a very controversial take, something that we would not have seen in Unit 1 or 2. Of a depiction on this, that you see Charles towering as this huge colossus over this English town, and in the middle of the town, as usual, is a church. We see a church there, but now instead of the church being the tallest symbol, the church being the most influential, now the monarch is. And what a perfect way to go back to Unit 2 and do the end of the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, to talk about how it changed the balance of power. This drawing is a great representation of how that balance of power is going to shift now. We're going to see less influence in Europe from the church and nobility, and more centralization in power and influence on the state, on the monarchy, going forward through the rest of this semester. Like I said, what a great way to bring this up into discussion and trying to go back and look at some of the questions you did the day before in the seminar or earlier in the class for the seminar. So this is great. And then lastly, if you have time, I have source 5, which is Hyacinth Regaud's portrait of Louis XIV. I really like this one as well. It shows off, you can ask students, who back then could afford a portrait. Why is he depicted in a certain way there? He has a sword with him. Why is that the case? Why does he have a cane, but yet his cane is not he's not leaning on the cane, therefore to imply that he might be weak or ill or handicapped. He's like holding the cane up in the air. He has the symbolism of the crown. This is the Sun King. So it's a great way to bring up elements of a portrait as well. So many good visuals to go with in this unit. But remember, this unit for many students is difficult because there's a lot of names, a lot of individuals that students have to know going through this unit. That's why I like starting off every unit in a philosophical way, using their voice and discussion. For students that are not as comfortable using their voice out loud, they can type in a chat together. So they're all practicing argumentation, practicing the use of evidence and lines of reasoning with what they're bringing up. But the second day or the second half of your block that you're using, that's when you're starting to add the contextualization in. That's when you're getting to the specific terminology that you're going to use the rest of the unit. And this should be a great gateway to start the beginning of Unit 3, go through your topics in the AP course guide and hit through things you need to do. And you can always spiral back to some of these visuals later as you're going through the unit. And then I think it's great to maybe throw these visuals in again at the very end of the unit. I do a Socratic Seminar that are a lot more difficult questions, and they are specifically content-based. And they're trying to basically measure their confidence, measure their content knowledge for the test that's going to be the next day. So again, this is just my teaching style. Every one of us have different styles. You may have methods that are much more effective than mine, and I would love to hear it. I would love to have you on the podcast at some point. I would love to have an email from you sharing any kind of resources you have. That's one of the main reasons I have the community and the podcast, is to learn from other people, learn from other educators along the way. So I know this episode was about a little over 30 minutes. I hope that as a student or as a teacher, this helped you as far as getting an idea of how to start off Unit 3, how to make a meaningful connection to start off, give students a voice, practicing historical skills. They're reading, they're annotating, they're speaking, and they're looking at visuals as well. This is a great way to have a rigorous and also energetic beginning to your Unit 3. And it's something that's worked really well for me, and I intend on continuing to do it. But I would also love to modify and add things down the road as they go. So without further ado, as always, I hope the rest of you have a great week and be contagious.